Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But what happens when the past comes knocking? Tonight, in a quiet suburban home, a woman takes her final breath. Her body limp, blood pooling beneath her. The man standing over her? Daniel Reese, a seasoned prison guard. A man who enforces control. But tonight, he's lost it all. The crime scene tells a brutal story. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, and a phone screen still glowing with a single message. A message that shattered Daniel's reality in an instant. But this murder? It's more than just a crime of passion. It's the climax of a twisted history. Of power, cruelty, and a truth too dangerous to reveal. Who was Olivia Reese? And what did she know that sealed her fate? This is not just a murder story. It's a reckoning. Power, control, fear. These were the pillars of Daniel Reese's existence. In the dim corridors of Blackridge Prison, where the air was thick with desperation and unspoken horrors, Daniel was more than just a guard. He was judge, jury, and executioner. A towering figure in pressed uniform, with eyes that saw weakness like a predator stalking prey. Inmates whispered his name in fear, but those who suffered most knew him by something else. Monster. He wasn't just ruthless, he was meticulous. There was a pattern to his cruelty, a calculated way he broke people down. For Daniel, pain wasn't just a punishment. It was a lesson. He believed that suffering was the only language criminals understood, and he spoke it fluently. New inmates learned quickly. Don't step out of line. Don't show weakness. Don't let your eyes linger on him for too long. Because Daniel didn't just enforce the rules, he created them. And he was the kind of man who enjoyed bending them. There was the young inmate who flinched when Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Just a flinch, nothing more. But Daniel saw it as disrespect. So he made sure the inmate flinched for real, with a baton swung hard enough to break ribs. Then there was the one who refused to eat on Daniel's watch, protesting the rotting food the prison served. Daniel locked him in a dark, airless room for days, leaving only a plate of spoiled meat to rot beside him. By the time the door opened again, the man was on his knees, eating with his bare hands. And then there were the worst punishments, the ones that left no bruises. The ones that happened in shadows, in empty hallways, in soundproofed rooms where screams went unheard. Daniel thrived on moments like these, on the feeling of absolute control. He made the inmates fear him more than they feared the prison itself. And the ones who suffered most? The ones who didn't fit his rigid mold of what a man should be. Transgender inmates. Gender non-conforming prisoners. To Daniel, they were a stain. An insult to the natural order. Something to be corrected. Something to be broken. He made it his personal mission to erase them. Isolation. Beatings. Psychological torment. He refused to call them by their chosen names. Forced them into situations that stripped them of dignity. Turned the other way when other inmates did worse. And the worst part? No one stopped him. Not the warden. Not the other guards. To them, Daniel was simply maintaining order. But even monsters have blind spots. Even the strongest walls have cracks. And Daniel's came in the form of a woman who seemed too good to be real. Olivia. Gentle. Radiant. A woman whose kindness was effortless. Whose presence felt like sunlight in a world he had long since let rot in darkness. When he met her, something inside him shifted. She saw him, really saw him, in a way no one else ever had. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt something foreign. Something dangerous. Vulnerability. She was everything he never allowed himself to want. She softened his edges, made him believe he could be more than the man the prison had shaped him into. He was drawn to her warmth, the way she listened, the way she laughed, the way she made him feel like there was still something inside him worth saving. He proposed quickly, too quickly. He told himself it was love, but deep down it was something darker. A need to claim her, to possess her, to fold her into his world before she slipped through his fingers. And she said yes. God help her, she said yes. The wedding was perfect, at least that's how it looked in the pictures. Smiling faces, a stunning white dress, vows spoken in trembling voices. And then, one day, Olivia made a mistake. A simple mistake. Careless one. She left her phone unlocked. And Daniel saw the message. A name. Passed. A secret unraveled in an instant. His wife, his Olivia, wasn't who he thought she was. In that moment, everything he believed, everything he built, came crumbling down. The room was silent, but inside Daniel's head, there was nothing but noise. His hands tightened around Olivia's phone, his pulse pounding against his skull like a war drum. His breath was shallow, ragged, caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. He stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, as if the words might change, as if reality itself might bend under the weight of his rage. But it didn't, and neither did the truth. Olivia Reese wasn't Olivia at all. She was someone else, someone from his past. A ghost with a new name, a new life, a new face, a lie. Daniel's shadow stretched across the hallway as he made his way to the bedroom. His fingers twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. The weight of betrayal sat heavy in his chest, pressing against his ribs like a vice. He had given her everything. His name, his home, his control. And in return, she had made a fool of him. He pushed open the bedroom door, and there she was, Olivia, sitting on the edge of the bed, unaware. The soft glow of the bedside lamp painted her in warm light, her face peaceful, lost in whatever world she had been living in before he stepped inside. Before he saw her for what she really was. "Who are you?" His voice was low, guttural. The sound of a man whose entire world was coming apart at the seams. Olivia looked up, her brows knitting together, confusion flickering in her eyes. But she saw it. Saw the way his shoulders were squared, the way his chest rose and fell too fast, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Daniel," she started, her voice careful, but he cut her off. Don't you dare say my name like that. Don't talk to me like I'm your husband. Like I don't know what the hell you are." And then, she laughed. A small, breathy chuckle at first, then something fuller, something sharp, something cruel. "So you finally figured it out," she said, tilting her head slightly, her lips curling at the edges. "Took you long enough." The room felt smaller, hotter. Daniel's hands trembled. His entire body tensed. "You knew," he spat. "You knew I would find out eventually." Olivia shrugged, her expression unreadable. Maybe I wanted you to." Daniel's nostrils flared. The walls pulsed. The air between them felt thick, charged. His vision blurred at the edges. He had spent his whole life in control, bending others to his will, crushing the weak beneath his heel. But now he was the fool, the joke. A man who had spent years tormenting people like her, only to marry one, to love one. And Olivia? She wasn't afraid. She wasn't begging, crying, apologizing. No, she was taunting him. "You're disgusting," he snarled, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "A freak." She just smiled. "And yet you loved me. You kissed me. You held me at night." He lunged. The moment happened in flashes, his hands colliding with her shoulders, forcing her back against the headboard. The gasp that escaped her lips, the flicker of fear that finally appeared in her eyes. He needed that. He needed to see it, to remind himself that she was prey, that he was in control. "You lied to me," he growled, his fingers wrapping around her throat. "You made me a joke." Olivia choked out a breathless laugh. Even now, even with his hands tightening, even with her life dangling by a thread, she was still smiling, still mocking him. "You were already a joke, Daniel. I just let you believe otherwise." The red mist came fast, blinding, absolute. His grip tightened, her breath hitched, her legs kicked beneath him, her nails raked against his arms, his face, his chest. But he was stronger. He had always been stronger. And now, finally, he was proving it. It took less than a minute, maybe less than 30 seconds. He didn't know. Time stopped mattering. When he let go, Olivia slumped forward, her body limp, her lips parted slightly, her last breath still hanging in the air. Daniel staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. His fingers, his wedding ring, were still pressed with the deep imprints of her skin. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Reese felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: fear. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, a god among men, but standing there, staring at the lifeless body of the woman he had once loved, he knew that no amount of power, no amount of control, could undo what he had just done. And worst of all, this wasn't over. Not even close. The weight of her body pressed against Daniel's muscles, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he hauled her down the steps, out the back door, into the night. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting pale silver light over the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of rain, a storm brewing in the distance, as if the world itself was preparing to wash away his sins. He had to be fast. He had to be smart. He had to make sure Olivia Reese disappeared. The lake was just beyond the trees, a quiet, forgotten body of water where the town's secrets had been swallowed before. He knew this place well, knew what the dark depths could hide. Dragging her body to the edge, he paused, chest heaving. For a moment, he could almost hear her laugh again, that same mocking tone from before, the one that had driven him to wrap his hands around her throat, the one that had pushed him over the edge. But she wasn't laughing now. She wasn't anything. One final shove, and she slipped beneath the surface, swallowed whole by the black water. No struggle, no resistance, just the silent acceptance of the dead. It was done. The weight was gone. But then, why did his chest still feel so tight? He stood there for a moment, staring at the ripples distorting the moon's reflection. Then, wiping the sweat from his brow, he turned and walked away, leaving no footprints, no sign that he had ever been there at all. Daniel had barely stepped into his house when the sound shattered the silence. His heart slammed against his ribs. His phone, still slick with sweat, buzzed in his palm. The screen lit up. Incoming call. Unknown. He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the screen. It was late, too late for a wrong number, too late for coincidence. He swallowed hard and pressed, accept. A long, heavy silence on the other end. Then, "You killed our friend." Daniel's blood ran ice cold. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. A pause. Then, a quiet chuckle. "You thought she had no one, didn't you?" Daniel's throat tightened. His hand clenched around the phone. This wasn't possible. No one knew. No one could have known. "Who are you?" he snarled. But the line was already dead. Daniel Reese thought he had buried the past. Thought he had erased every trace. But the past wasn't done with him yet. The morning felt like an eternity. Daniel hadn't slept a wink. His mind was too loud, too full of the choices he had made, the things he had done. The phone call from the night before echoed in his ears. A constant reminder that someone knew. Someone was waiting for him to crack. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid burning down his throat. The silence in the house was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. Then, the phone vibrated again. Another message. This time it wasn't just a text. The notification showed a video file. His heart skipped a beat. His fingers trembled as he opened it. At first, it was nothing but static, a faint buzz of noise before the screen cleared. The video began to play, showing the interior of his house. The living room, the hallway, the bedroom. He didn't recognize it at first, but as the footage shifted, he saw it, hidden in plain sight. The CCTV camera, a small, discreet black device tucked above the doorframe, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Olivia had known. She had known the moment he had walked into that room. The footage clicked forward, and there they were, Daniel and Olivia, caught in the quiet before the storm. The argument, the rage, his fists clenched, his breath coming heavy as he yelled at her. She stood there, her expression calm but defiant, her eyes never leaving his. The video was too clear. Every detail, every movement, captured in high definition. The camera caught it all. The exact moment when Daniel lost control. The moment he grabbed her by the throat. Her final struggle, her gasp for breath. The sight of his hands tightening, squeezing the life out of her. And then the screen went black, and a new message appeared. We have you on tape. The moment she died. Everything. The CCTV footage is clear. The message continued, almost casually. You can't escape this. You can't run. We've got the evidence and we know exactly what you did. $50,000. 1 week. Or we show the world the truth. Daniel's stomach twisted. His fingers tightened around the phone, but his grip was weak, trembling. He had been so careful, so sure that no one would know. But this wasn't just a witness or a call. This was evidence. Clear, irrefutable proof of his crime. His mind raced as the implications set in. Who else had seen it? Who had access to the footage? And why hadn't they acted sooner? It didn't matter. All that mattered now was the deadline. The money. The price he had to pay to keep the truth buried. He sat back, his hands shaking as the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He could run. He could try to hide. But someone was watching. Someone knew. And they weren't going to let him forget. The days bled into one another. A relentless cycle of tension and fear. Daniel's once orderly life had spiraled into chaos. The blackmailers kept coming, each demand pushing him further into the abyss. And with each demand, he was forced to give more than he thought he had left to give. The first demand had been clear and simple. $100,000. He could handle that, or so he thought. He sold off what he could, borrowed from anyone who would lend it, and took out loans from every bank that would risk it. The money was scraped together in the darkest hours, and he sent it off, reluctantly, but willingly, believing that this would be the end. He had hoped it would be enough. But it wasn't enough. Nothing ever would be. 2 weeks later, the next message arrived. This time, the demand was higher. The tone more insistent, more urgent. But it wasn't enough. Nothing ever would be. 2 weeks later, the next message arrived. This time, the demand was higher. The tone more insistent, more urgent. $150,000. In 2 weeks. If you want us to stay quiet. Daniel felt the floor drop from beneath him. $150,000? He had already emptied his accounts, mortgaged his house, and drained every source of credit he could find. Where could he possibly get that kind of money? Daniel's mind raced as the blackmailer's demands piled on, suffocating him with every passing day. The $100,000 had been excruciating, but the next request for $150,000 pushed him to the edge. He had nothing left to give. He had drained every account, borrowed from everyone who would lend him anything, and taken loans from people who didn't care about his past, only about the money. The loans were stacking up, and Daniel could feel the walls closing in. But his financial ruin wasn't what consumed him now. It was the fear of who was behind it all. Who had the power to track him down so precisely? Who knew enough to have captured Olivia's final moments on hidden cameras? It wasn't just random criminals. It was someone who had been close to Olivia, someone who knew the house, the people, the past. He began to think back to Olivia's life before she had met him, the life she had lived as a man. Daniel started digging into her history. What he uncovered shocked him. Olivia had been far more connected to the criminal underworld than he had ever imagined. She had served time with other inmates who had shared her struggles, some of whom had suffered the same brutal treatment at Daniel's hands during his time as a prison guard. She had kept ties with these people, her former cellmates, the ones who had been there during the darkest years of her life. The more Daniel investigated, the clearer it became that these weren't just random strangers trying to extort him. These were the very people he had tormented, the ones who had seen his cruelty firsthand, the ones who knew exactly how far he would go to maintain control. Olivia's former cellmates had orchestrated everything. They knew about the CCTV cameras in the house. They knew about the way Daniel had reacted when Olivia confronted him. They had planned it all, and they had made sure to capture his every move. In his desperation, Daniel started tracking down the people from Olivia's past, convinced that they were the ones behind the blackmail. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to find them, confront them before it was too late. He tracked down one former inmate, a man he remembered from his days as a guard. The man had been part of a group of transgender inmates Daniel had abused, broken down, and dehumanized. Daniel thought he might have information, something that could lead him to the blackmailers. The confrontation was quick, brutal, and ugly. Daniel broke into the man's apartment in the middle of the night, demanding answers. The former inmate, who was no stranger to fear, wasn't intimidated by Daniel's forceful demands. He mocked Daniel, taunting him, knowing that the powerful prison guard was now just a broken man desperate for answers. "You really think you can stop this now?" The inmate sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You're already dead, Reese. You just don't know it yet." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, but he didn't stop. He forced the man to give him names, to reveal who was behind the blackmail. As the truth began to emerge, Daniel learned the horrifying reality. Olivia's former cellmates, some of the very people he had broken and destroyed in the prison system, had orchestrated the entire blackmail scheme. They were the ones who had planted the cameras, the ones who had meticulously planned every step of the trap. It was a game of revenge. They had waited for years, biding their time, watching for the perfect moment to strike back. And Olivia had been the key, a pawn in their master plan. They had used her, knowing Daniel's vulnerability, and now they were using him to get everything they wanted. Daniel's world shattered as he realized the depth of the manipulation. He had been played, and worse, the people who he had once brutalized were now in control. The blackmailers weren't just extorting money from him. They were destroying him, piece by piece. He couldn't stop them. Every time he tried to make a move, every attempt to get closer to the truth, they were always one step ahead. He was chasing ghosts, trying to catch people who knew him better than he knew himself. But the more he fought, the more reckless and desperate he became. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Daniel thought he was regaining control, but the blackmailers blindsided him. They exposed him to the police, tipping them off with evidence. Videos, recordings, and documents detailing his past crimes. In the dead of night, the police raided his home, uncovering the truth about Olivia's murder and the evidence of his twisted actions. Daniel's attempts to keep his secret were shattered, and as he was handcuffed, he realized it was too late. His last hope for escape was gone. The media frenzy followed his arrest, exposing his brutal past. The trial was a spectacle, with damning evidence laid bare. Olivia's friends and former cellmates watched as Daniel's life unraveled. The jury didn't hesitate. He was sentenced to life for Olivia's murder and his years of cruelty as a guard. In the end, there's no escaping your past. Not when it's built on cruelty and lies. As Daniel was escorted into the prison, his former kingdom, he was met with whispers from inmates who remembered the man who once tormented them. His former power was gone. Once feared, now just another prisoner. The walls that once represented his dominance were now closing in on him. The irony was thick in the air as he walked deeper into the very place where he had ruled. The cycle of abuse had come full circle. This time, there was no escape. What would you do if your worst secrets were exposed? Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true crime and gripping stories.